working in the classroom, I really think that our students feel like they're facing an existential crisis right now on multiple fronts. And in our institution, we want to prepare them, give them the tools, give them the capacities to be able to navigate those various waters, both while they're in high school, but beyond that as well.
Wow, bright lights, big city. Nice to see you all. I'm Gloria Duffy, co-president and co-CEO of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs, which is the combined World Affairs Council and Commonwealth Club, a merger we did almost a year ago. We are so happy to have you with us here this evening for this program in our Creating Citizens project, educating in turbulent times. And boy, what times aren't turbulent, right? So again, what times are not turbulent when you think of the history of our country? My ancestors came before the Revolutionary War. They were farmers who settled in Pennsylvania. And I think about them often, how they must have debated the issue of separating from Great Britain, becoming a separate nation, a separate national entity. What an issue at that time. During the Civil War, or before the Civil War, debating the issue of slavery and then the issue of the separation of the South and trying to keep the Union together. World War II, World War I, the Holocaust, Vietnam, all of these eras were eras of deep divisions and different viewpoints and debate amongst our population about the crucial issues of their time. I came of age during the Vietnam War, which was one of the most deeply divided times, including in education, in the educational environment. When I was in high school, we were debating the Vietnam War, whether we should be there, what the issues were, the performance and behavior of our government. And I remember when I went to look at colleges in my junior or senior year, the first college I looked at was Stanford and came on the day after the windows of the business school had been smashed by students angry about Stanford's participation in research on armaments and for the war effort. Then I went to Reed College in Portland, and I could not have my interview there because the administration building was closed and occupied by students who were flying the North Vietnamese flag from the administration building. So the issues of the time deeply divide students, faculty, our citizens, and in some cases they erupt into conflict. Conflict both physical sometimes, as in those cases and many others, Kent State and so on, you remember, and sometimes psychological violence or attitudes about other groups in society who have opposing views or represent groups seen to be responsible for something negative going on. I received the message through an excellent education in the Acalanes School District in Contra Costa County to be engaged, to debate, to express my views, but not to engage in destruction. And I think that's what we want for our society. We want kids to be able to debate, have their views, express them, but see themselves as capable and potent to achieve change without destruction in constructive ways and productive ways. What I did was with another friend in high school at Acalanes, we founded the Lafayette Youth Commission, which is celebrating its 53rd birthday, serving youth in the community of Lafayette and giving them a voice in city issues, local issues, community issues. And I see so many young people who are doing incredible things, serving needs of homeless, stalking cyber criminals, and finding ways to participate and make a difference in the issues of their day, but in a very dedicated, well-informed, constructive, and positive and potent way. So finding that balance to be able to have open discussion, informed dialogue, have students feel comfortable expressing their views with respect for one another and respect for their views, and constructive engagement rather than destructiveness. I think that's what we like to see in our society. Finding that balance is difficult. And to discuss that today, how to find that balance, and to hear your input and your ideas, we have a terrific panel. It's going to be moderated by my friend and my classmate in American Leadership Forum, Ann Skeet. Ann has a terrific background in so many relevant fields. She has a BA from Bucknell and an MBA from Harvard. I first met her when she was a senior executive at the San Jose Mercury News. She worked for the Knight Ridder Corporation. She became the director of American Leadership Forum. She has been she's currently director of leadership ethics at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. In between, she was president of Notre Dame High School, the head of school in San Jose. So she's had experience across business, media, education, nonprofits. And she will be a terrific moderator for tonight's discussion, and she will introduce our panelists to address this very tough issue of educating during turbulent times. Thank you very much, and welcome to Ann Skeet and the panel.
Great. Well, thank you, Gloria, for that wonderful introduction. I'm Ann Skeet, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for this important and very timely conversation. Schooling in the United States is an ambitious and complicated endeavor, and it seems also to have become an increasingly political one. Perhaps this is to be expected in a diverse and pluralistic democracy in which education is seen as one of the means of preparing young people to engage in civic life. Disagreement is built into all aspects of our politics, and it extends into conversations about what and how we teach our students. But when those conversations devolve into conflict, the theoretical can become personal, with educators struggling to navigate the fiery emotions of the moment while continuing to prioritize student learning and well-being. Our speakers today know this all too well. With perspectives informed by teaching and leadership in varied educational settings, our panel will explore the challenges and the opportunities of educating students in the midst of conflict and controversy. So here to my left is Anikia Ford-Morthell. She's an urban educator and community activist dedicated to creating public education experiences that are revolutionary, relevant, and responsive for students and families. With over 23 years of experience, she has facilitated the turnaround of underperforming schools and the incubation of new schools in some of the Bay Area's highest needs communities. She currently serves as superintendent of the Berkeley Unified School District. Compelled by her commitment to create the conditions for each and every student to succeed, Anikia leads districts to reimagine what teaching and learning can look like in every classroom. She believes that responsive leadership requires deep listening and authentic engagement with those doing and impacted by the work. Anikia, who holds a BA and master's degree in education from the University of California, Berkeley, sees education as social justice in action. More than a profession, this is her passion. On the end is Dr. Holly Royalty. She's been a high school teacher for 21 years, having taught in the Advanced Placement, International Baccalaureate, and Advanced via Individual Determination programs. She is a teacher and department chair at Kathleen McDonald High School in the Santa Clara City Unified School District. In 2016, Holly earned her EDD in Educational Leadership and Social Justice from San Francisco State University, where her work centered on the post-secondary success of first-generation college students. She currently serves as a teacher leader with the Integrated Action Civics Project, associated with the UC Berkeley History and Social Science Project. Her work there focuses on integrating civic engagement skills, such as power and stakeholder analysis, as well as practices such as deliberative dialogue and discourse into high school history courses. And in the middle is Dr. Regina Stanback Stroud. Her scholarship and expertise focus on leadership, diversity, economic empowerment, and anti-poverty strategies. She has dedicated 35 years to higher education, serving as the chancellor of the Peralta Community College District, president of Skyline College, and as a professor. She is now the CEO of RSSC Consulting, facilitating racial equity and literacy development. Regina served on President Barack Obama's Advisory Council on Financial Capability for Young Americans. She holds a Doctor and Master of Arts degree in Educational Leadership from Mills College, a Master of Science degree in Human Relations from Golden Gate University, and a Bachelor of Science in Nursing Sciences from Howard University. Welcome to Creating Citizens and Commonwealth Club World Affairs, Anikia, Holly, and Regina. It's great to have you all here, and thank you for making the time. So we're going to get started, and what we hope to have tonight is a free-flowing conversation where we can sort of talk to each other and about the issues and hear from each of you as you wish to comment on the questions. This first one, I want you to just start, and I'll begin with you, Anikia, is what is the purpose or the good served by your institution? What is it for?
So I have to start with Berkeley's mission. Our mission is to enable and inspire our diverse student body to achieve academic excellence and make positive contributions to the world. And I think that is the work that we do. We set the conditions for our students who range from early education all the way to 12th grade. We also have an adult school to make sure they have the skill sets, the knowledge, and the dispositions to be able to actively engage in life post high school, to be able to make decisions, to think critically, and to be able to actively be a part of our democracy. The good that we do is just that we create environments so that our students can learn, so our students can grow, so our students can try out who they want to be, what they believe, what they think, so they can explore, so they can innovate, and they create, so that when they get to be parts of the larger society, they've already exercised those muscles and feel okay and comfortable in exploring who they are and being around others in community.
Great, thank you. Regina?
Well, thank you. I'll answer that question from two lenses. The first lens is as an educator, as an administrator in higher education, the purpose of that institution was to educate and transform a global community of learners. And what that meant was that we were interested in making sure that people accessed education as a practice of freedom. And if you look at it as a practice of freedom, it means having those options in their life that make better their lot in life. But I had the opportunity and the pleasure of being able to do the work with RSSC. And with RSSC, we work with educational institutions to disrupt systemic racism, processes, practices, procedures, and policies that create conditions and experiences that you can predict by race. So in both ways, I could say that the purpose of the organizations in which I've had an opportunity to provide leadership has been about providing for a better society.
Great, thank you. And Holly?
Since I work in a high school, I feel the main purpose of our institution is to get students prepared for life beyond high school. And just to say ditto to everything you hear from my colleagues up here, but working in the classroom, I really think that our students feel like they're facing an existential crisis right now on multiple fronts. And in our institution, we want to prepare them, give them the tools, give them the capacities to be able to navigate those various waters, both while they're in high school, but beyond that as well.
Great, thank you. So on this next question, I'll let whoever feels moved to start can speak first. Controversial topics have been around across the ages. What is different about how we're engaging with them now? And how have the rules of decorum changed?
Well, I don't mind. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So I don't mind starting. As a matter of fact, that question is the reason that I actually have paper in my hand. I was admiring the fact that my other colleagues here on this dais, are just out here with no notes. But but that question made me realize that in many ways, I'm not sure that I agree that topics have been around for a while. And I'm not sure that it's just that the rules have changed. What I think we're seeing is the culmination of a lot of things that are going on, the culmination of anti-intellectualism and the celebration of anti-intellectualism in our society, and particularly in our nation. We're seeing the culmination of what is emerging as a change in demographics and what I call white fear. Because as we look at a time, at precisely the time where whites will no longer be a majority in this nation, already not a majority amongst 18-year-olds, that was 2020. In 2027, 18 to 29-year-olds, they will no longer be a majority. In 2033, 30 to 40-year-olds will no longer be a majority. And so what you see is this changing demographic that is increasing the fear that somehow status, benefits, and privileges will be lost. And so when you combine that fear, the increased normalization of hostility as a strategy in the highest offices of this land, and you combined it with the anti-intellectualism and then the public disinvestment in education, I believe we get to this point where we think that, well, we're highly divided. We're no more divided as a nation than we were divided at many other areas in our time. We were divided during the considerations of slavery. We were divided during the considerations of different wars. We were divided during the Vietnam War, et cetera. We're no more divided as a nation. What we now have is permission to say the unspoken things out loud.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks.
And just to add on to that, I also think that schools and educational institutions, and again, I'll speak from a K-12 background, that those are gray areas for policy, that schools have been battlegrounds for policy and social change since the beginning of the public school era, going back to the 1920s, looking at the Scopes monkey trial and whether or not evolution should be taught in school, looking at the controversies over free speech during the Vietnam War, looking at the controversies over transgendered youth rights right now. So it's an interesting place because minors are involved, and there are advocates on the parent side, there are advocates on the education side, there are forces with social media, there are forces with policy, and all of those things sort of interact with schools in a very interesting way. Schools are there to educate, and they are there to teach children, and I think what gets really contentious is what is being taught, and how is what is being taught either upholding sort of dominant power structures, or is what's being taught challenging dominant power structures. And I think that's where a lot of the crux of the issue is.
I started off with Berkeley's mission about enabling and inspiring our diverse student body. And I talk about how our district's mission is pretty revolutionary. The idea that, regardless of what you look like, where you come from, your language, your socioeconomic status, that you can achieve academic excellence, that you can offer something positive to the world and make change, is not what the public educational system was intended to do. So as we hear and see more diverse students, right? We weren't ready for this. The system, we are pushing against a system that is pretty persistent and pretty stubborn and never was designed for diversity of folk, but also not diversity of thought or perspective. And so I think that is what's different. Whose fact is the fact? Whose story gets to be told? You're seeing that across education, period, right? As folks try to it's my story is the story. But this idea of multiple perspectives and multiple experiences, it's very uncomfortable, and we're not ready. And our response has been to silence and shut up and sit down and don't talk about it. But that very in itself is against what we are trying to do as educators. As we talk about students living and being amongst diversity and difference, we have to have an educational system that creates the atmosphere so that they can get familiar with that. We are too unfamiliar with that. We are all in our silos and our staunches, right? And then we want our students and our schools to replicate that. And so I think that's what's changing.
But Anika, I actually, I agree with you, and I actually want to combine with that what you have is now high stakes because you have the criminalization of education and literacy. I mean, this is not the first time in our nation that we've had that, where you actually criminalize certain types of education, certain curriculum, and even literacy, the ability to learn. And we've had that at another time in our history of our nation when we had, when we had slavery and then post-Reconstruction. And those are some things, if we look at some parallels about what was happening then and what's happening now, there are several parallels that we can see. So I really appreciate that point that you're making.
And I appreciate another point you made, Anikia, when we were talking before the panel, as we were getting to know each other and talking about this evening. And it picks up on something Holly said about the fact that the students are minors.
That's right.
And so when you say that we're not ready, I think one of the things you pointed out in that conversation was that the students are ready.
Students are ready.
But the parents maybe are the group that's having the problem with it. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Our babies are ready. They are in classrooms engaging in robust and rigorous conversations. Our babies are familiar with different of ideas, different perspectives. And when I have heard folks say that my child is unsafe, or my child is in danger, or my child doesn't want this, it is oftentimes the adults themselves that don't want it, because the babies have been saying, oh no, we want it. The babies are saying we are ready and let's engage. And again, our charge and our responsibility, and it's quite honestly an honor as educators, is to create, again, those conditions for that to happen. The babies are not uncomfortable.
Right.
The grown-ups are uncomfortable. How about I say this? The babies are okay with being uncomfortable, because that is, again, what we've done as educators. That's our job, is to help them understand what it feels like, and that it's okay to be uncomfortable, to be engaged in situations and settings and ideas that are unfamiliar. Our adult response is, shut it down, it's unsafe.
And we're willing to do that in order to prioritize that comfort at the expense of suffering, at the expense of not exploring those ideas, at the expense of the lack of discovery of knowledge and education, and at the expense of not being able to engage in the inquiry that's necessary for us to be able to advance as a society.
And I also want to add that I think as the needs of education change, like Anikia pointed out, and as the methods of education change, the other battle is that the schooling that kids are going through right now is very different than the schooling of their parents. And education is that strange field where everyone went to school, for 8, 10, 12 years, and therefore everyone considers themselves an expert in education because they've had that experience.
That's right.
And so, teaching English or history or languages other than English, when it's happening in a way that's very different than a person's experience, that is, I think, very disruptive to the family, or can be disruptive to the family, where they say, what are you learning in your history class? And a kid comes home talking about ethnic studies, and their parents are saying, well, I didn't learn that. Why are you learning that? Why is it different than what I learned in my previous experience?
So, Holly, what's your take on whether or not classrooms are even the right place to be having these conversations?
I think they are a glorious place to have those conversations. I think, again, going back to the conversation of safety, one thing that a classroom has is a relationship where those conversations aren't happening out in the middle of the lunch yard where there's no way to essentially moderate, right? Learning how to have those conversations. And I think as things change, education, and again, I'll speak to history education, used to be very much read the textbook, respond back to the questions, take a test, move on to the next chapter. And when you're starting to look at things in a deeper way or in a more inquiry-based way, it's not that the lines aren't as clear. And so I think what classrooms provide is they provide some structure and some boundaries and some strategies and the impetus to learn how to have difficult conversations. And I think sometimes people think it's a given that we just know how to have conversations. Mm-hmm. And I think actually most of us probably had to learn how to have difficult conversations. And maybe it was hidden curriculum. It was something that was not explicitly taught. And I think one major change that's going on right now and what classrooms can provide is explicit instruction in how to navigate those waters.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think we need to teach people how to talk. I used to run a program, which Gloria mentioned earlier in her introduction to me, American Leadership Forum, which serves the CEO population from the public, private, and nonprofit sector. So it's like an intentionally diverse set of people who go through each cohort. And, nearly 20 years ago now, we started to provide dialogue skills for CEOs, in part because CEOs tend to think they have to have the answer to every question in the room. So having dialogue with a CEO can be a challenge in and of itself. But also, they also felt like they had to have the answers. And so there really are skills that you can translate and provide to students and probably to parents about how to engage in those difficult conversations and in things where people are not necessarily agreeing. So I definitely agree with that idea.
I just wanted to kind of build on that. I'm an elementary teacher first,
I noticed
so I did this. I agree that the classrooms are the right place. I think that those conversations should be happening in lots of places, but I just want to piggyback off of why the classroom is so unique, right? At home, you could have the conversations, but the likelihood is that most of the folks in the home are going to think the same way, right? The classroom, again, is an opportunity to be with people who are different than you, different experiences, different backgrounds, different perspectives. But I was also thinking about my own children, and we're in the house, and they have ideas. Lots of ideas, and they got me, and I have my ideas, right? And how it must feel as a child when you are always having to engage with an adult to maybe think that my voice doesn't matter, my opinion doesn't. The classroom is unique because it's 20 to 1. It's 20 kids to one adult, or it's 30, right? And so now I'm in a space with folks who are like my peers, and I might feel that much more comfortable to try out an idea or to ask a question or to push. Sometimes our kids don't push at home. Mama said this is what it is, that's what it is. And so just wanted to piggyback, because the classroom is unique for so many reasons and is the place for conversations to happen for all of those reasons.
So what support do teachers need from administration when navigating controversial discussions in the classroom?
Oh, I feel like that's coming to me. I would say that I think one of the struggles is the tension between the standards and the content and the skills that you're required to teach, and then the capacities and abilities and training it takes to engage in some of these other pieces, like dialoguing, deliberative dialogue, recognizing multiple perspectives. Those are their own skills. And so I think that what administrators need to understand is just that teachers need training, and they need time, and they need freedom to implement and try, and just like students, the ability to try and fail in some cases and try to fail forward. And again, that gets scary, I think, because when we talk about teachers trying and failing forward, or something's not as successful as we want, there are students in the room. But if we don't model that freedom, then how are students supposed to learn about those same aspects? So I think training, I think freedom, I think support, those are all different ways that administrators can support teachers, and I'm sure there are others.
And those of you with some administrative background, so then what can teachers do to help administrators be supportive?
Well, I wanted to.
Go ahead.
Nika, please. I wanted to also comment on, what Holly just said about what teachers need. And if I can add to that, I'm looking at it from the standpoint of higher education, where what many times teachers need is for administrators to have the political courage to give them public support and affirmation.
That's what I was going to say.
They need for the administrators to be willing to mobilize resources so that they have access to legal support or financial support in these arenas, as long as they're in the context of the roles that they're in following the board policy. Yeah. They need for the administration to provide emotional support, professional development, all of those things, and empower them to be able to engage in these. Because if all of a sudden everybody starts sucking in their guts to avoid being hit by the flying bullets, and they leave them out there, they leave those faculty out there by themselves, then they are not going to be able to engage in this difficult work. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we're making decisions as administrators, we're making decisions in the interest of our own safety. And then I think what teachers can do in order to make sure, the second part of the question, ask the second part of the
Well, what teachers can do to help administrators understand their needs and support the process.
From my perspective, I have found that I need for teachers to do things like document information, document the scenarios, be able to make smart decisions about when to engage and not engage if they're accosted or confronted or approached, to share positive student feedback, because students will let them know how much they appreciate, enjoy, how it impacts their learning decisions. To share the teachers are commonly the experts in the research and the literature, so to share that, make that available to us for us to be able to support them in their work as well. And then also to give us their gut checks, to give us the potential sensitivities that they know are coming, that I may, as an administrator, not necessarily have thought of or been conscious of, because I'm not in that role or realm any longer.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Oh, if I could just piggyback on one more thing, only because I think Regina brought up a really excellent point, because I think there's two directions of the conversation. There's what teachers are doing in the classroom, and then there's the conversations that they have with people on the other side of that. And I think that recognizing that there are two different ways that teachers and administrators are engaging with controversial topics and difficult topics is also important to know, and that the resources and strategies and support are needed for different aspects or different elements.
Mm-hmm.
I would ditto everything that was said. I think one other thing is that I learned a couple of years ago when I was in San Francisco is the need for us as administrators to create space for the educators themselves to engage in controversial conversations. Right? We're thinking about always the educator with the babies, and we should, but I need my own space. With my colleagues and my peers, because we have difference of opinions, right? And so that is something I think that's oftentimes avoided, that we're going to help you, we're going to PD you to talk to the kids, but we're acting like we don't understand there's elephants in the room when we're in collaboration and when we're in PD, and that we're not on the same page, and we also have differing ideas and perspectives. So, how do we make space for our educators to engage in rigorous conversation and discourse and dialogue?
And sometimes it means you're naming it. Like, one of the things that I commonly do is I do two things that I think help shape people's decisions to engage. One is I make sure that people understand that we have a complex history in this nation, and that we are pretty unsophisticated about race, and that a lot of things have racial dynamics and racial implications. I actually agree with Ijeoma Oluwa, who says you cannot have a nation that is founded on the genocide of a people and built on the chattel enslavement of another, and think that it is ever not about race. As long as this nation shall exist, it is about race. So I understand that even when we think we're talking about leadership, budget, whether you're transparent, the culture of the institution, the curriculum, academic standards, I understand those implications. And so because of that, one of the things I commonly say is that we're going to get it wrong. We are not sophisticated. None of us are as culturally fluent or racially literate as we want to be. We are going to get it wrong sometime. So we have to give each other permission to be imperfect. So that's one aspect that I try to establish, that we're going to get it wrong. The second thing I commonly try to name out loud is that we are looking at some of those regular structural tensions in education between faculty and administration, or faculty and classified professionals, those status and power differentiations, even depending on what side of the house. If you're in counseling versus instruction, then who's more important and who's more important to the students, et cetera. All of those are regular structural tensions that exist in education, probably in K-12, but definitely in higher education as well. And when we name those things out loud, sometimes it gives us room. Once you name it, it gives us room to be able to navigate it and give each other a little bit of room to engage.
So Regina has reminded us that sometimes we're going to get it wrong, but maybe
Definitely.
From Holly and Anikia, we could hear a little bit about what does it look like when we're getting it right in terms of teaching controversial issues in classrooms.
I think when we're getting it right, the conversations feel natural and students are asking questions. So I think when students are entering into a space and they have a lot of questions, we know we're doing our job. I think even though the tendency might be, oh, this is a scary topic, so we're not going to talk about it at all, and shutting down the conversation and shutting down the curiosity, shows that we're not really achieving the missions that our institutions are set out to achieve. So to me, I think a successful piece is students are asking questions of each other. They're asking questions of the teacher. It's okay for people to not know. Uncertainty is a natural part of life, and it also opens up the possibility to engage with new ideas and new perspectives. So, without delving too deeply into lessons and things like that, I think the more questions students are asking, the better we're doing.
The president of Wesleyan, Michael Roth, has written in the New York Times that he hopes his campus will be even more political this year. He notes the challenges of talking to one's neighbors about what we want from our lives in common and the reality that there are many visions of how best to live in community. How should educators help students identify ways to build community in such contentious times?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that my answers would be different now in these quote-unquote contentious times than it would be in any other time. I think what it requires to be in community is to recognize, one, who you are, but recognize that there's others around you, to appreciate the ways in which you are like those others, but also to appreciate and respect the ways in which you might be different from those others. Mm-hmm. To be in community means to be able to listen, to have empathy, to be open to different ideas, and so to not be so stuck on who you are and what you think. Requiring you to be kind of flexible and nimble, if you will. So, I mean, there's a whole list of things I can talk about when I think about what it means to be in community. I don't think then when we are in contentious or controversial times that what it means to be in community changes. I think then we are called and challenged, like, are we really a community, right? I think those situations are controversial or contentious times require us to lean in, because then we have to ask ourselves, like, oh, we thought we were a community when it was all good. But now that there's something that's challenging us, we have to ask ourselves questions. So I think it's the same, but it's the test. Mm-hmm. And then you always, as a community, should be reflecting and growing and thinking about what do we need to do differently and how do we need to behave differently so that we truly are in community in good times and in not so good times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also think that it's important to center what we want students to walk out of the school with. And if what we want them to walk out with is a sense of community, a sense of justice, a sense of social or civic responsibility, then those are the things that are centered in the classrooms. And that the history that we teach, the literacy skills that we teach, those are all just vehicles to get to those larger pieces of community, of justice, et cetera. That the real learning is actually the community-based piece, especially now. I think now I'm thinking of my students who were in 6th grade in the pandemic, who were really separated from their community, and sort of redeveloping those aspects of life for them are critical. And so, my pedagogy has switched to be much more about centering those larger ideas rather than just teaching history or teaching literacy or whatever. That those are just the vehicle we're in to get to these larger pieces.
I think that when I think about helping students build community, I think about it, I step back a little bit and think about it from the standpoint of what the students bring. And the reality is that if we as educational leaders listen to the students, they actually come to you with their notions of what community looks like, what they need in community, what they want to do in order to create that community. They come to you with their affinities and affiliations. And we, in many ways, have to be able to recognize that and recognize it as kind of cultural and social capital that they come with and cultural asset. And in many ways, we have to be smart about recognizing that many of those of us who are in these positions of influence and consequence, the faculty particularly, come from different perspectives, ideological perspectives, as well as cultures than do the majority of the students in that class. And when I say what I mean by that is many of the students, because now the majority of the students that are in we serve in at least the institutions of higher education in which I had the opportunity to work with are students of color. They come from collectivist cultures. Many of the faculty, at least in the California community college system, is overwhelmingly white. They come from individualist cultures. And so the consequence is their notions of what community is and then how you behave in that community is very different. So much so that what might be considered good and valued and respected in a collectivist culture is actually criminalized and labeled as plagiarism or not following certain rules or not meeting some guidelines in an individualist culture. And so I think that part of us supporting students in building community and helping them build community is for us to make ourselves smarter about what they bring to the table and to listen and hear their ideas and be able to then mobilize the resources of the institution to support them in building that community.
Thanks. So I like stories, and I bet you guys are full of good stories about student learning experiences. And I wonder if there's one where you can talk a little bit about where a controversial topic has led to a certain breakthrough in a student learning or understanding of a topic.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I have a couple of different pieces and projects that we do, but one thing that we do at my institution is we have all students engaging in they have a civic engagement project that they start as a 10th grader and then carry forward to 12th grade. To be fair, we are a new school, so we only have 10th and 11th right now, 9, 10, and 11. We will have 12 next year. So we're embarking on this journey. And it's been really fun to watch them start to apply the skills, the historical thinking skills and topics from class to these larger projects. So I actually just had a student this week, actually, who we were looking at doing a problem analysis, root cause and consequence analysis. Like, how do you take a huge problem like he's looking at homelessness and start to break that into parts and pieces that you can address or research more fully and things like that. And he just kept coming back to the idea of private ownership of housing. And private ownership of housing, we were looking at the propositions that are on I teach civics, so we were looking at the propositions on the ballot, and he just kept saying, it's all about the money, it's all about the money. And I was like, follow the money, like, where's the money leading you? And he's like, when are we going to talk about this? What other systems are out there? And he was just like flabbergasted because he had just had this experience of going through and really taking apart this issue over the course of a couple weeks, and then arriving at his own understanding, which he is now, I think, going to follow along, but follow the money. Where is the money leading in any of these given things that we're talking about? So it's like his light bulb went on.
Sorry. Any others?
I mean, there's probably many. My example or my story that's coming to mind is not a light bulb moment or aha for students, but one in which the students, to me, were models for what could be light bulb moments for adults. Thinking about last year, there were a number of student walkouts and protests and things that happened in our district and on our high school campus. And I was at many, most of them actually, and was in awe to watch our babies. One of our largest high school has 3,500 plus students, and at any given time there's 200 students doing a rally or a protest and really expressing their opinions and their ideas, which means there's another 3,200 students who are just going about their day. They are, some of the adult instinct would be to counter protest or to shut it down, and to watch these babies just stop and notice and say, hey, there's some folks who have opinions, and some of them stopped and listened. Others just went to class. Like, it's normal. It's okay for you to have an opinion that might be different than mine. But the part that really moved my spirit was we were during one of the walkouts. I was supervising the walkout, and students were actually walking. Students who had a different opinion, who were on the other side, if you will, were walking with the students who were protesting and engaging in conversation. When you say this means this to me. What does it mean to you? And then went back to the classroom and engaged in a conversation. Again, so not what I think that a lot of adults do instinctually. Our idea is it's bad, it's wrong, we need to shut it down. Our idea is we need to counter-protest or speak louder than the voices that we're hearing. And our babies' ideas are, someone has a different opinion. I might stand around and check out and see if I understand that. Or, hey, let's walk and talk. They were doing walk-in talks during a walkout, during a protest. Y'all ain't seen that before, only in Berkeley. And so, again, I just think that there's definitely stories to tell about light bulb moments and ahas for the babies, but what really moves and inspires me as an educator are the many ways that our babies are examples and shining lights and models for us of how we can do better and really engage in discourse and conversation and difference.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on some of the events of the last year. Any big takeaways from the events of the last year? Things that you learned or would do differently or think we can apply going forward?
You mean takeaways from what's happening in general in society, or
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would have to say that what I've walked away with is that it's not enough just to be right. I've watched as people try very hard to be responsible, effective educational leaders, and do so at a time when they are having to preserve their mental and physical well-being, and struggle to have the influence that typically leaders in education should have or would have, teachers, administrators, college presidents, etc. And so I've watched that it's not just enough to be right, but that we have to be effective, we have to be strategic, we have to build relationships, we have to make ourselves smarter about how to navigate some of these things. And the takeaway is also that nothing's never neutral, that it is in many ways highly political when we think it's not political. Sometimes explicitly political, but highly political when we think it's not. And so my takeaway is, eyes wide open, and to recognize that it's not enough just to be right.
Great. I got so many.
I know. I know.
No, I won't say it.
That part right there.
I take the responsibility of educating and inspiring, minds and spirits very, very seriously. And I talk about being from a collectivist culture. I really do believe in this idea that it takes a village and this idea of collective responsibility and collective accountability. And last year, I probably knew this before, but last year was very clearly, let me know that there's not really a collective. There's a lot of folks who are like, and what is education doing? And educators, you are the source of all evil. And you are the reason why all the things in society are what they are. And the school is just a microcosm of society, just so y'all know. It comes in to the school, and that is why we're supposed to set conditions and help our students know how to think and navigate, et cetera. But there was a lot of scapegoating. There's a lot of blaming. There's a lot of hands off, it's not my responsibility. So my learning was, one, that I was aware that we had this responsibility, but even more aware last year. But what I would do differently is probably tap some folks on their shoulders a little bit sooner, political leaders, religious leaders, right? Where y'all at? What you doing? And, just this idea that was like, the schools is where everything was happening. Yeah. Why are we pretending? Yeah. The walkouts, the protests, the conversations, the debates were not just happening in schools. They were happening outside of schools, but no one wanted to be responsible for that, or no one wanted to even convene. Folks were like, hey, Nikia, you should do a town hall. You should do a fireside chat. You should solve all the world's problems. And I'm thinking, well, where are you? Why aren't we having meetings in the community centers, in the churches, where are the other leaders? And so that was an incredible burden last year, but I take issue with that. I think, again, we have an incredible responsibility as educators, but it is not us alone who prepares these babies for life. And it is not us alone who should be responsible for when grown-ups, because it was the grown-ups, behave badly.
Well put. Well put.
I think my hope actually, from everything that's going on last year, let's be honest, everything that's gone on since the beginning of time, The history teacher in me, I'm like, well, I can't pinpoint a start where we've been not dealing with stuff, right? But I think sort of to Regina's point, the eyes wide open and not pretending that things aren't happening. That's because right. to pretend to be neutral is to pick a side, right? You can't be neutral on a moving train. So when we don't talk about something, we're picking a side. When we do talk about something, we're picking a side. And I tell this to my students all the time. You're much better off having someone who's open with their bias than someone pretending they don't have one. Mm-hmm. And so I think being open and having conversations and calling things out and giving students permission to explore what's going on in the world, I think is really critical.
Great. Well, we've started to get some great questions in from the audience, and so I want to turn to those now. And this first one's, specific, but I know there's resources on the panel that can address it. Have you found any resources, approaches helpful to facilitate discussions on sensitive topics effectively? So things you could point the audience to that they might reference.
There are a couple of things that we commonly use around communication and engaging in difficult conversations. Sometimes we do training for institutions on how to have what they call difficult conversations. Usually that means conversations about race, gender dynamics, those types of things. So there are different kinds of tools that we provide, and those tools are in the context of books and resources. Nancy Dohm wrote a book. I think she said, "Let's talk about race and other difficult things." She is out of Epic Education, and it's an easy read, fast book that has a workbook with it as well. She takes people through this process of having how to have difficult conversations using what they call a RIR approach, and it is to recognize, interrupt, and repair. And I'm the worst student on some things. I just want you to know. So whenever I go to a workshop and I got to go through the RIR repair, I'm like, okay, I got to listen and learn this, And I even found myself like using it. I'm like, this stuff works. So she trains organizations, institutions, faculty, staff on that RIR protocol. Stone and Heen, is it Sheila Heen and Douglas Stone out of Harvard, wrote the book Difficult Conversations. And actually, Sheila Steen has done most of the scholarship, but most people identify it with Douglas Stone. But Sheila Steen is really the one who has done a lot of the scholarship around it. And that is where they train you on how to have these difficult conversations, and that you really are having 3 conversations when you go through that process. And I used that book when I taught. I used to teach in the doctoral program over at Mills College and at San Francisco State University, and I used it in some of my courses. And I would have students come back and say to me, not only did it help them in their work, but it saved their marriage or saved their relationship with their teenage child or whatever it might be. So those are a couple of resources that we use to support people in learning how to have these conversations.
And I've used in the classroom some of Glenn Singleton's work around the courageous conversations, and I just use just a starting point, which is helping students understand how they enter into a conversation. So it's called, I think it's called the Courageous Compass, and it talks about how we enter in from an intellectual standpoint, an emotional standpoint, and when we talk about it, I'm like, yes, we're using this for history class, but let me tell you, if you get in an argument with someone that you're dating, you want to know how they're entering into that conversation. It's very, very important. So I use that. And then just instructionally, the Berkeley Integrated Action Civics Project has some really great exercises. One is called the Deliberative Dialogue System, and it's a structural conversation around with 3 different perspectives, and people sort of talk about the issue from 3 sides. And what it does is it removes the polarizing aspect of 2 sides. It makes it non-binary, which kind of allows that conversation to develop, I think, in a more organic way.
I would just throw in two other resources. One is that, I referenced trying to teach CEOs how to have dialogues. And so we drew heavily from a book called Dialogue, The Art of Thinking Together by William Isaacs, where they did a lot of research, looking at how conversations unfold and applied a family systems model to a conversation and can teach you how to kind of unstick a conversation that's gotten stuck. Just by taking on one of these 4 different roles that they teach you about how they unfold in conversations. That's one resource. And the other is a local organization. Well, it's national. It has a national presence, but also a very strong Bay Area presence called Facing History and Ourselves. Mm-hmm. And they do, I think, really great work and provide lesson plans and will work with civic groups as well as schools through the lens of things that have already, that have happened in our history that we can learn from. Mm-hmm. So those are 2 that come to mind. Mm-hmm. So great. So on to the next question from the audience. Have any of you heard of or used the approach started at Smith College based on calling people in versus calling people out? These strategies are creating more inclusive learning environments that address conflict and hostilities that respects everyone's humanity. Have any of you heard of this?
I've heard it referenced. I don't know very much about it. In the ways in which I've heard it referenced has been around paying attention to not shaming and embarrassing someone, but to invite them into the conversation. Sometimes it gets mixed up with, or there ends up being this tension between, you're calling somebody out, not calling them in, versus tone policing. And so identifying how I'm supposed to be responding to the oppression that I'm experiencing. So, but I can't say that I could speak knowledgeably about it.
Well, it sounded like what was behind the question were just sort of practices of inclusivity. Sure. So if there's any others that you have to draw on or to share, maybe that would be good.
So one of the things, and this is a struggle, this is one of those answers that's going to leave you more with questions than answering your question. It's really not going to answer the question at all. Okay. But one of the things that I kind of struggle with is sometimes people will say, well, the practices are you come up with some community agreements. It used to be guidelines, but then they offered some community agreements. And I get that. But I struggle with that because I struggle with anybody trying to define how I'm supposed to feel and respond and moderate my self, voice, body in relationship to it. So I don't know if that is I think if you ask someone else, a lot of people would say that that's one of those things of inclusivity, that you set up community agreements and then everybody kind of agrees, that everybody talks and everybody listens, and you kind of have some agreements about how you're going to engage, what the rules of engagement are. But as I tell you that, which I think a lot of people really believe, that I'm also signaling to you that I'm not sure that I buy into that idea.
Mm-hmm. Any other inclusivity practices?
I'm trying to think of something specific offhand, and I can't think of a specific practice as much as it goes to a lot of what we've talked about here, which is, relationships and relevance. I think building relationships is the most inclusive thing that we can do. And I think that organizations and educators do that in a variety of different ways, sometimes through community agreements, sometimes through deliberative dialogue, through collaborative work. But on that note, I think teaching people how to collaborate is also its own skill. I think there's a lot of things people take for granted that we're just supposed to know. Like we're just supposed to know how to build relationships and know how to have a community agreement and know how to work together. And I think all of those are actually things that need to be taught. And I think that in teaching those things, being sensitive to how people do those things in their own experience and in their own environments, that's the art of teaching, right? Is knowing, the science might be all the strategies, and then the art is going, well, what are these kids already walking in with? What are my adults walking in with? How can we kind of take what they already have and work with that to get the relationships built so that we can actually have real conversations about anything?
Yeah, I just want to plus one to this, the importance of relationships. I was in a conversation today on our campus at Santa Clara University with students who were gearing up for the election and thinking about how this moment in our nation's history and all that comes along with it. And really, in the discussion, sort of emphasized this idea of going towards the relationship, of being curious about other people and asking the questions to understand, well, why do you think what you think, and what lived experience have you had? But really, the overriding guidance was just, going towards each other and really investing in those relationships. So I think that's really important.
I feel like. We've talked about how the classroom and schools are places to learn about others. I just want to say that the classroom is also a place where the individual learns about themselves. Mm-hmm. And so when you're just thinking about you and you're talking about the norms, now you don't really get down with the norms because you feel, right? I think, there's lots of classrooms that create norms, and part of our role is to create space. And it's rare, but we have to create space for the individual student to reflect. Like, what came up for you? Like, how were you feeling when that happened, and why? And so I just wanted to name that we are definitely learning how to be in community and with others. But we're also learning who we are and how we move and how we learn and what makes us feel comfortable or uncomfortable. It sounded like you raised your voice to me. I didn't raise my, and so just wanted to that's a part of our work. And that is a part of us making sure that our babies graduate and leave ready to be productive and successful citizens and have successful lives. I got to know what my baseline is. I have to know what my triggers are. I have to learn how to regulate. Ooh, I almost jumped over that table. But I caught myself and I felt that. Just keeping it real, those are the things that we have to teach our babies. And if we never engage in difference and discourse and disagreement, then we also, not only do they miss out on the chance to learn about others, but you miss out on the chance to learn more about yourself.
Mm-hmm. I want to say, though, I think I'm missing the chance to, I don't want to miss the chance to talk about how do you create inclusion, period. And so when you create inclusion, it is because the people in the room recognize and see themselves in the ways in which you are teaching and learning and engaging. It is because they see their contributions of them and their peoples valued and reflected in the curriculum and the processes, etc. Inclusion means that some of the strategies and the processes that we use and define as good standards or high academic integrity are not just representative of a Western Eurocentric notion of learning and being. Mm-hmm. So that inclusion means creating that environment that shows that, quite frankly, that classroom, that curriculum, that syllabus, and that pedagogy, and that environment has been decolonized, for lack of a better word, that it has been decolonized. That can create the inclusion.
And it takes time. So it's there are 100, and again, I'll speak to K-12, we have 180 days. And so when you have 180 days to work with a group of students, to me, in that case, time really is money. Every class is currency. Mm-hmm. And so it's how do I want to spend that time? And I think, over the course of my 20 years in the classroom, I've moved from being somebody who needs to cover all the things to I'm going to cover some things very, very well with that time for reflection. Because I actually think that it's more important that they learn about themselves, because if they learn about, anyone who learns about themselves and knows their baseline and where they're coming from, how they enter into a conversation, they're going to be able to learn whatever they want. I am not the holder of information anymore. That's Google. So our role has sort of changed, I think, as educators, that teachers used to be the knower of all the things. And, I can't know faster than Google's AI search, they're going to know faster. So then it becomes about, well, what do they actually need to learn in school? And it's like media literacy, self-reflection, self-awareness, self-empowerment, all of those various elements I think are much more important.
Well, that's in our courses that we teach leadership. We start with that self-awareness. It's that self-knowledge is everything, so critical. All right, we just have time for one last question, and I thought it would be fitting to end with this expression of gratitude from someone in the audience, thanking you all for serving students with passion and compassion. As a former principal, I was kept awake every night worrying about school safety. So let's hear from the three of you. What keeps you up at night?
Right now, November 4th, I'm sorry.
I have sweaty palms just thinking about it.
Any thoughts or concerns that you have, that things that you're pressing on you in the work that you do?
I appreciate the question because, I will admit that a lot of times I engage in these kinds of things, and, we have questions that I engage like a test, question, come up with the right answers. But in asking that question, I just simply thought back to what was keeping me up the other night, right? And it was all about having the resources, being able to mobilize the resources to be as generous as I want to be, to be able to influence or use my position of influence and consequence as a leader, to be able to make changes and use that position to be able to make the world better. That there were some real things keeping me up that were about resources, were about people's own well-being. There were some things that were keeping me up that were about, quite frankly, my mental health and others around me, about my physical health. At one point I used to be a dean at, I was at Mission College in Santa Clara. Mm-hmm. And, it was a very small administration. There was never enough time. I was a brand new dean. I had just come out of the faculty ranks, and, and I also came in with all of me, and when and where I entered, the whole race enters with me. And so there was no way that I was going to not have something done or meet certain objectives, etc. What that meant is that I commonly went to bed very late, but what I could do is I could count on my one hand the number of days that I left that college before midnight. Mm-hmm. And I could count it on one hand. And then I would even tell the custodians, come get me before you leave, so I'm not the only one in the building. You know what time they left? They left at 4 a.m. And so what I realized one day is that, look, I developed high blood pressure. What's going to happen is I'm going to develop high blood pressure. I'm going to be gone. They're going to have a moment of silence in the agenda on cabinet. They're going to say, wasn't Regina nice? A moment of silence. And then they're going to move on to the next agenda item. And so I had to make some decisions right there about self-care and care for the others that were working around me to support the agendas that I was trying to support as a leader. So that's what keeps me up at night.
Well said. Well said. All right, thanks. Anything else, Anikia, Holly?
I sleep well. Seriously, so a couple things. There's many. One, again, I think to do this work, you have to just be a special kind of person. And I do worry about the fact that there are fewer and fewer people wanting to go into education, that the turnover is high, and even the folks who are even trying to get credentials is incredibly low. And so I worry about the profession because I think it's an incredibly critical profession. And I worry about the teachers who are in it now, who are leaving and dropping because they don't feel supported, because they don't feel respected, and because they don't feel valued by our society.
That's right.
So that worries me. I worry about the babies oftentimes. Just the other day, a student had put up a flyer with their point of view, and the adults were like, "Rah!" Like the way that people politicize and adultify. I just worry that the babies will not have that safe space that we're trying to create to explore and to try out things and to be curious and to mess up and to try again and be redirected. It worries me because they're very much aware of cancel culture. They're very much aware of people saying, oh, you said this, then you must believe that. And so that worries me as an educator who really sees my role as, again, creating those spaces and giving them opportunity to mess up and to try and to reinvent themselves and to write, imagine, and dream. And then I think the other thing that I see some folks in the audience who've worked with me for a long time. This is a big deal, and I find that as a superintendent, there's all these things that folks want me to talk about, and all these things that folks hold me accountable to that, quite honestly, are outside of my purview and outside of the scope of what I signed up to do as an educator, and that folks very rarely ask me questions about the things that I really signed up to do the thing that you signed up to do. The kids can't read. Ask me questions about teaching and learning. Ask me questions about, how my babies are performing and are they moving towards mastery and can they think? And I just feel like there's all these distractions. Mm-hmm. There's all these distractions. And so, ultimately, I guess what keeps me up at night are the babies and making sure they're well and good. But if we don't have the right folks in front of the babies every day, they're not going to be well. If the babies are afraid to express themselves and explore, they're not going to be well. And if we continue to be distracted by all the other things, instead of focusing on educating the babies, they're not going to be well. And as a result, we are not going to be well as a society.
That's right. Well put.
And I'm just going to add one last piece to that, because mine is, I'm gonna go to the epiphany that I had in 2016, and I can't believe I didn't have it before, but every year we seem to go through a cycle of events, and people say, "How did this happen? How did this happen?" And as a history teacher, I go, "This is not new. This is not new." And so my epiphany that I had in 2016 that really changed things for me, and this still keeps me up at night, especially as we head into this year's election. And I teach civics and government. I literally can't avoid any of this. I have to talk about it every day. And economics and U.S. history, I have to talk about it. So, but my epiphany was, when I think of my history experience and the way that students have learned history over time is we keep starting at the beginning and getting to 1970. And then you go to your next history class and it's history of the world and you start at the beginning and you get to 1970. And what I realized is now we're in 2024 and we're 55 years away from 1970 and we have essentially a blank space. Mm-hmm. And so I think in my role for what I do, the thing that keeps me up at night is how are we going to make sure that the people that are going to inherit the earth, such as it is in their own existential crisis of climate change, what students are experiencing right now is nothing that any of us experienced as students, because it wasn't a thing, it wasn't defined. And they're looking at 2040 in a really different way than I ever looked at 2040. And so I think for them, what can I give them to help them through this incredibly fraught time, and how can I help them understand the world that they are now, not by starting at the beginning, but really looking at what's gone on in the last 50 years or so. So I don't want them to ever have to ask, how did this happen, in that way.
Well, it's evident that each of you is giving the students quite a lot. And so I want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone who has joined us this evening, both in person and online. A special nod to our speakers, Anikia Ford-Morthell, Regina Standback-Stroud, and Holly Royalty. To learn more about Creating Citizens and find out about Commonwealth Club Affairs programs, visit commonwealthclub.org and follow them on Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm Ann Skeet, and this concludes our program. Have a wonderful evening.